Power, sex, chrome. After World War II, everything returning GIs wanted was coming their way. The American love affair with the car was about to shift into high gear. After 4 long years of hardship, Americans were yearning for the good life.
And everybody, as they came home, the first thing they went for is, well, where do I get a car? The people at home were rationed. There were no cars built during the war. It took a while to switch over from building tanks and jeeps to building cars, so they were always short.
In Oregon, Illinois, a sleepy farm town in America's heartland, returning soldiers waited years for a new car. At a nearby Pontiac dealership, Herb Davis saved the few new cars he got for his oldest and best customers.
Oh, I had, I think, 8 cars in the year of '48. And I had a list of about 200 people that wanted cars.
I remember the first car I bought, I worked for Ford when I'd get on a waiting list. And everybody was so hungry for them, they didn't care. They didn't care about anything. They just wanted a car.
Detroit's Big Three had nothing to offer except cars designed before the war, dressed up with a little chrome trim.
It wasn't until about 1949 that really new cars started to appear.
One of the first is the 1949 Ford, and it's a completely redesigned automobile.
When I first saw that, I thought, wow, look at that car, a Ford.
The design was ultra-modern, a real shocker from Ford, whose styling had begun to seem a little dowdy. Underneath the sleek and sexy body was the company's first new suspension system since 1906. Driving the new model, they claimed, was like riding on air. Automotive luxury was all the rage. You could now shift without a clutch, and you could signal a turn without sticking your arm out the window. Along with big overhead valve V8 engines, you could have power doodads galore. Options like power windows, power seats, power steering, and power brakes were about to take gadget-happy Americans by storm. In the 1950s, we were like kids in a candy store.
I mean, this was the same era, let's not forget, when men's ties suddenly got totally wild. The same spirit of let's go wild, we deserve it, was applied to automobile design. And by the late 40s and early 50s, you have the first signs of the automobile as something almost irrelevant to its function. You have the automobile as a piece of rolling sculpture.
Every fall, under heavy security, General Motors rolled its new models into the ballroom of New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. They were the best-kept secrets in the country. Crowds lined up around the block and waited for hours just to see what next year's models would look like. Inside, Broadway musicians and choreographers prepared for a car show extravagant enough to make the national newsreels.
Now touring America's principal cities, General Motors Motorama is attracting crowds like this one of 55,000 New Yorkers who throng to the Waldorf Astoria on opening day. In the hotel's grand ballroom, the show is on. A ballet tells the story of the progress of engineering. After the ballet, standard production models from each of the 5 automobile divisions parade onto the mechanized stage, accompanied by models wearing specially created gowns.
It was interesting to see your designs in this environment because you were so familiar with it and you worked so hard on it. You saw it through all the changes and all the times that things weren't working. And then finally to walk into Waldorf and with the lights on this model and see this thing finished was really an exciting thing for the designer.
The man responsible for all this hype, not to mention the look of half the cars in America, was Harley Earl, head of GM's design department. Working under him was Chuck Jordan, who in 1949 was hired by Earl at the tender age of 22.
I remember when I went there, I thought he was God. He was 6'4" and had this dramatic appearance. But he had something else. He had a very clear vision of where he was going and what he wanted.
For decades, Earl had helped keep General Motors on top, with Chevrolet outselling Ford almost every year. He had started out in the 1920s, designing cars for Hollywood celebrities, and at GM brought that same sweeping feel of glamour to cars for regular folks. The Earl look could be described in 3 words: longer, lower, wider. Over the years, he got rid of running boards, sunk headlights into the fenders, and revolutionized bumper design. Earl went crazy with color and chrome and pursued his vision with an ego as big as any movie star.
Were you ever in Harley's office? This office was longer than this house. It was all old English, very heavy English design. He had his desk on a dais at the end. So when you walked in there, by the time you got at the end of that thing, you were like this. You're a blithering idiot. And he did it on purpose. Anybody came in there with a gripe or gonna, stand up to Harley, no way. By the time you got down there, you were like that, see.
Harley Earl once fired an employee for wearing a necktie identical to his, and insisted that all of his 650 subordinates call him Mr. Earl.
He'd come in the studio, and he'd plunk his big frame down in a chair, and he'd put his arms out, and he'd say, "Now, fellas, here's what I want you to do. See that line? Lower that a 1/16 of an inch." He was so imposing, and he told me that one time, and I went up there, and I was shaking so hard I couldn't get that line right, but he stayed on that until he got exactly what he felt was right.
Earl was also a gifted corporate infighter, the only vice president on a first-name basis with Alfred P. Sloan, the head of General Motors.
He had a mandate from Mr. Sloan. He was Mr. Sloan's man. He was more important than the engineers, than the manufacturing man. And if Engine Charlie Wilson or Harlow Curtis ever challenged him on a car, they'd say, they might be in a drawing room and Harlow Curtis might say, "Well, I don't think I agree with that." And he'd just pick up the phone and he'd dial New York and he'd say, "Alfred, Harley Earl here. Now I've got,
Earl's job was to get customers out of the perfectly good car they were driving into a new one. He did it by making the car in our driveway seem hopelessly out of date, tempting us with new car designs every year.
Well, Harley Earl understood that the car was fashion. He understood that you could artificially induce demand by making the public perceive that they should want the newest.
Here's the car that's almost too new to be true. The 1958 Chevrolet.
To change the car every year was our goal. We loved it.
They were outrageous. They were ridiculous. They were crazy. They made no sense at all on a practical level. But people loved them. People yearned for them.
They were all different. The fins were different. The side trim was different. In the 50s, you could tell a Chevy from a Ford from a Plymouth at 100 yards.
One I'm thinking of in particular was a Chevrolet, and they had like a kind of a diagonal design on the side.
The Mercury Turnpike Cruiser. I remember that one.
My very first car was a 1958 Cadillac. It was titty pink with a white top.
Harley Earl was shameless about adding sexual symbols to his cars. Cadillac sprouted bumpers that came to be known as Dagmars, after a bosomy TV starlet. Phallic ornaments and chrome crevices soon appeared everywhere. In the midst of this design orgy, one company tried a bold new approach. With no Harley Earl on its payroll, Ford was desperate to find something, anything, that would edge out the competition.
Watch this.
In the mid-1950s, almost 40,000 people a year died in car accidents.
Know what's in this barrel? A teacup. One fragile teacup. Let's see what happened to it.
So Ford decided to market a car with safety as the selling point.
Not even a crack.
Meet one of the busiest men in town. He sells 56 Fords.
And that's not all. In addition to Fords, I sell safety, like this new Lifeguard steering wheel. It acts as a cushion on impact. You can have the instrument panel and sun visors padded for additional safety. And Lifeguard seat belts, a Ford option that keeps you firmly in your seat in case of sudden stops.
And we made a determined effort. This wasn't just put your toe in the water. We really advertised the hell out of this and promoted it. Mr. and Ms. America weren't ready for us.
Well, the American consumer could care less. I mean, the American consumer did not want to be reminded that you might die in a car.
I used to get letters from women saying, get those seat belts out of my car. They're lumpy because when I sit on them, the buckles. I said, well, you're supposed to fasten them, you know?
And when Ford tried to sell a car based upon some modest safety innovations, it just fell flat on its face because people wanted sex and glamour, and General Motors was giving it to them.
The 50s would be defined not by the safety belt, but by a Harley Earl design feature which contributed nothing but glitz. It was called the fin.
Wow, another new Chrysler. That rear end looks just like a jet plane.
Some manufacturers claimed that fins made their cars aerodynamic, but most people just liked the way they looked. Car makers rushed to copy the fin. Kaiser even put them on its little Henry J. Then Chevy turned the fin sideways. Rumor had it that the gull-wing tail of the '59 Chevy would make the car airborne at high speeds.
Detroit always overreacts. When one guy did the fins, the other guy did bigger fins. And before you know it, they were chrome, big yachts, boats.
The emphasis on style over substance would someday come back to haunt the American makers and the American car buyers who had cheered them on.
The consumer was very, very interested in glitz. The consumer wanted this. The consumer encouraged the auto industry in the pursuit of the annual model changeover that was just superficial design. I mean, Harley Earl tapped into the American psyche. He understood it.
peak of tail fins was 1959 on the Cadillac, when the fins were, I believe, measured at 40 inches off the ground. And they were as pointy as a dagger. And there were many stories, I think probably mostly apocryphal, about roller skaters and pedestrians being impaled on these fins.
The high-tailed 59 was Harley Earl's last caddy before retirement. 5,000 pounds, 345 horsepower, 7 feet wide, and 19 feet long.
Cadillac convertible was just the most exciting car I've ever owned. But with the top down, I'd be driving along and I'd think there was somebody following me over on my right-hand side. And I look around and it's the fin. You can look back and analyze the thing. I just gotta tell you, at the time, it was the right thing to do.
The 50s. Everything we did on wheels. And with more and more cars on the road, we began to wonder if all traffic would someday come to a dead stop in massive gridlock, coast to coast.
We gotta slow down, so much traffic cuts the flow down till they bring the highways up to date. You can bet your high compression we're gonna be late.
The open road was closing down, and no amount of horsepower was going to get us home in time to watch Howdy Doody with the kids.
Will you stop honking, Mac? We ain't going nowhere. No wonder everybody's acting so nervous. What's a citizen gonna do? What can a citizen do?
The answer was to build more highways, and lots of them. We paved enough new road to circle the earth 10 times. A lot of this asphalt was paid for by something called the Interstate Highway Act. Superhighways were promoted as a way to move tanks and trucks in case of invasion by the Russians. But the real winner was the American driver.
It'll be possible to drive from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean without a single stoplight or stop sign.
With a price tag of $186 billion, it was the most money we'd ever committed to anything, other than war.
You probably never had as powerful a lobby for anything in American life as you had for that, because you had not only the automakers, you had the unions, you had not only the construction companies, but you had the construction unions, you had the oil and gas lobby. I mean, everybody was for it.
Highways looped and merged and cloverleafed their way across America. On-ramps, off-ramps, changing how we lived and where we could live.
Today, a remarkable construction project is transforming the face of the countryside.
A developer named Bill Levitt had flattened a potato field to grow a new kind of crop. Assembly line housing in look-alike neighborhoods, where even the building contractors got lost.
I think what Levitt did makes them as important a figure in our society as Henry Ford. Mass-produced housing, 18 in the morning, 18 in the afternoon. I believe it's 180 a week. There were 27 different teams. There was a team for windows, a team for slab, team for the doors, team for the bathrooms. I mean, like clockwork.
Another day, another 40 houses.
Soon, ranch and split-level homes began springing up all over the country, almost as fast as the crabgrass that surrounded them. A young couple could buy a new house for well under $10,000. And for returning GIs, Uncle Sam would co-sign the loan. The baby boom was born here, in a world of barbecue sets and picture windows.
You were king of your castle, and you had your own coach. You didn't have a neighbor next door who was making noise, or above you or below you. This was paradise, American style. I mean, it was the great dream of the 1950s, and I think a lot of people believed it and lived it.
The suburbs were unthinkable without at least one car, if not two.
It sure is good of you to offer to take me to the store. I don't know what we would have for supper tonight if you hadn't.
Well, I know how it is.
Back when a husband's salary could support an entire family, most women stayed home with their children. And automobile companies spent big money reassuring everyone that women could handle 150 horses and still be 50s feminine.
You know, there are a lot of housewives who really give the family Dodge a workout. Day in, day out. Watch me, for instance. Our Dodge is a taxi. See? I take my husband to and from his train every day. Our Dodge is a school bus, too.
Like doing the dishes or folding the laundry, driving became part of running a home. But no matter how many miles she put on the car, the myth continued that women couldn't drive.
No, to the right. You gotta cut to the right anyway. Yeah, she's gonna hit if she doesn't watch out.
What's the matter, lady? Can't you drive that thing?
Well, maybe some people weren't great at parallel parking, but developers would soon make that maneuver a thing of the past.
So what happens is Americans no longer are going down to the central business district, but now they're going to a more convenient place where there's free parking for the automobile.
The mauling of America seemed to happen overnight. Malls bigger than Main Street, big as a whole town, hundreds of acres, thousands of cars. So big you could lose your kids, your car, and your mind all in the same afternoon. Businesses began to cater to people who wanted to do business without ever leaving their cars.
The grand heyday of drive-in culture and drive-by culture and drive-through culture was the 1950s. Drive-in banks, drive-in movies, drive-in everything. I mean, the pleasure was to be able to do things in your car.
Every drop of blood was drained out of their bodies. And they had wounds on their throats, like a gigantic leech might make.
What was that?
I don't know. You get in that truck and lock it up.
The Pines Drive-In was carved out of a cornfield about 8 miles west of Oregon, Illinois. Today, the Pines is abandoned. But on the night it opened, back in 1950, owner Chick Lamb remembers the whole town on the road and heading his way.
When we opened on opening night, we had a free movie for anybody that wanted to come. Well, it turned out we not only filled the drive-in, but there was a traffic jam 5 miles to the west of there. Cars were lined up along the pavement waiting to get in. But it was a new thing for people. They had never been to a drive-in. They were very curious on how it worked.
Like most small towns in the 50s, Oregon's drive-in movie theater was the place to be on Saturday night.
I shall make the earth my home,
and I shall never, never leave it.
The drive-in culture of America, I think, is symbolized by the drive-in movie, which was a symbol of freedom and sort of really brought automobility together with the movie theater. Those were sort of the two great products of American civilization, the cinema and the automobile.
On a typical evening, the box office would open and a parade of cars would start coming in. This would be people in luxury cars, sports cars, station wagons with mattresses in the back, and kids and dogs and cats and coolers, and a rolling living room, bedroom, and kitchen for the family, because they expected to be there till 2 or 3 in the morning for the triple feature. Gradually, as it got closer and closer to dusk, they would begin honking to remind us that, in their opinion, it was dark enough to start a show. Car honk is actually it's a very limited vocabulary, honk, but very expressive. One kind of honk is just honk, to say hi, and people would honk at each other just to acknowledge, hi, you're there. And then there's the stray miscellaneous honk, which I always attributed to some kind of in-car gymnastics, an ankle or an elbow or a shin or something on the steering wheel with teenagers in the car.
Yeah, you always wanted to sit in the front seat and not the back seat. The back seat was trouble if you were the boy.
The back seat was always the best because it had more room, you know.
Oh, Steve, I love you. I love you so much.
Oh, honey, I didn't mean anything against you. Just that I can't see a real woman like you tying in with a double rod like you.
People were just buried in themselves, and the windows would just all fog up. And you could walk down the aisles and see people's toes, all in the toe prints in the windows, the backs of the windows of the cars, you know.
Who are you?
A scientist, like yourself.
I'm getting out of here.
Stay where you are.
I remember this young lady I was with, and I was so trying to impress her, and you know, putting your arm around somebody was a major move. It took lots of thought ahead of time and all that sort of stuff. And I remember at the intermission, she said she had to go pee. You cannot imagine the force with which that word hit me in Memphis in the 1950s. That was like saying, I'm really a wild woman here. And I remember thinking I should reevaluate my strategy this evening because I had a hot number on my hands.
The later it got into the evening, the fewer and fewer heads that you would see in cars. But dutifully, we would project the film no matter how few heads were showing or none at all. I remember one triple feature where I think the first 2 films were something like Hands of the Ripper and Twins of Evil, and the third picture was Puffin' Stuff, which was a children's movie. Strange booking combination. About 2:30 in the morning, most of the way through Puffin' Stuff, I looked out and there was one car, no heads. But jogging in place to stay awake, I made sure they got the tail end of Puffin' Stuff all the way to the end credits.
Drive-ins might have been all grope and hope back in the Midwest, but in California, the drive-in underwent a radical transformation. You might even call it a religious conversion. On March 27th, 1955, Reverend Robert Schuller delivered his first sermon from high atop the snack bar of the Orange County Drive-In Theater. It was the last place he thought he'd end up. He'd been sent to California by the Dutch Reformed Church with $500 and instructions to start a new ministry.
There was not a hall to be rented. Unbelievable. I made a list of 1 to 10. The mortuary chapel, the school building, Seventh-day Adventist Church, Jewish synagogue. They're closed on Sunday. Number 9 was a drive-in theater. Horror of horrors. They said, you want a church service here? And they let me do it, free. I read advertisements in the paper every week, you know, come as you are in the family car. It was corny, but it worked.
It's a beautiful morning, God. Thank you. And we are alive.
Everybody has a soft seat by an open window, and we have parking for 2,000 cars.
Have the courage to take a chance. Dreams don't come true without running.
People knew they'd be private in the car, and they could relax in the car. They took their puppy dogs with them.
Fear, you know, and courage. What does it mean? Courage isn't the absence.
Famous people would come in their cars whose faces would be recognized, and I prefer not to drop names now, but my gosh, they wouldn't be bothered for autographs. The ministry was a success because people were relaxed enough to listen to what I was trying to say.
Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may God give you his peace in your going out and in your coming in your life.
I tell people that if every minister started his church in the snack bar rooftop, he would be an honest guy. Because the props are gone.
Hallelujah. Amen.
In the prosperous 50s, the American family seemed at peace.
Oh, Charlie, it's beginning to rain.
But there was real trouble brewing.
Oh, it looks like a bad one.
In movies like Rebel Without a Cause, American teenagers seemed to be at war with their parents. And teenage idols like James Dean seemed to be saying, if you want to get away from it all, make your getaway in the car.
In those days, you counted the days to get your license.
Getting the license wasn't bad. Talking my father into letting me use the car, that was something different.
You know, you had your independence. Especially for me, because we lived out in the country. A car was our independence, and we could go uptown, and we'd make U-E's. All night long, we'd make U-E's.
A whole new way of having fun developed for young people in cars, which was cruising, which was doing nothing other than just drive around in your car.
On a Friday or Saturday night, if us kids didn't have anything to do, about 4 or 5 of us would get in my Cadillac, and we'd go to Millage Hill, and we'd make U-E's. And we would get a sack of marshmallows, and we would bite half the marshmallow off, and we'd throw them out the window. And sometimes they would stick to Barney Five's car. And of course, the whole street would be littered with marshmallows, and then the cop would stop us, and he would kick us out of town. He said, I don't want to see you guys back in town all night.
It would be nothing for us to drive around, for me to drive around for 3.5 hours around San Diego.
Well, the longest I ever drove was we started riding around town one afternoon, like right after lunch. And we drove around and drove around and drove around and stopped and had something to eat for dinner, drove around some more. And we drove probably till about 2 o'clock in the morning. We never left the city limits of Byron. And I put 400 miles on the car.
At one time I had a girlfriend in Dixon, and I also had a girlfriend in Davis Junction. Each one was in 15 miles in a different direction, and it kept you quite busy to keep everything running and keeping everybody happy.
And then another thing I did, I shouldn't tell you. All right, well, I never really dated very much. And so we'd go uptown and we'd have nothing to do. We'd keep making our U-E's. And no one would look at us, so we'd take Kleenex and we'd put a Kleenex in each one of our nostrils and out our ears. And me and my girlfriend would make U-E's with these Kleenex out our ears, and we thought maybe we could get a boyfriend that way.
Joyriding in Daddy's car was one thing, but having 4 wheels of your very own was the teenage version of the American dream.
You became a man when you had your car. It was like long pants in the generations before us. When you had your car, you had your wheels. So hot rods were the essence of manhood in the 50s.
Even as a boy in Pasadena, California, Gray Baskerville, like a lot of kids, had a passion for speed. He was always looking for ways to get ahead of the other guy.
Let's say I got my first speeding ticket when I was 18, and I got a few more after that for, they called it speed exhibition. Yeah, but that's part of growing up in Southern California.
Southern California had always been on the cutting edge of things automotive. Cars were image, style, sex. They changed the way teenagers behaved. And teenagers, in turn, transformed the way cars looked and the way they performed.
In high school, you had three basic elements. You had the kids who were athletes, and so their time was spent playing football, baseball, you know, that. Then you had the kids who were academics, so they were preparing to go to college. And then you had kids who took auto shop, and they took machine shop, and that was the nucleus of the hot rodders at high school.
A hot rod usually starts out as a clunker. To the uninitiated, that's probably what all hot rods seem. Sway-back jalopies ready for the automotive version of the glue factory.
Every cent you could generate working part-time in a gas station or at a parts house or being a box boy or delivering papers or whatever went into that car.
A teenager could buy an old wreck for as little as $25. 32 Ford Roadsters, Model A's, and T's were all popular. Hot rodders became modern-day Dr. Frankensteins, resurrecting jalopies from the dead, with parts collected from junkyards and speed shops. The idea was not to restore the cars to their original condition, but to build creations that were lighter in weight and fast.
The cars could be very crude on the outside, but you lift the hood, and there was a gleaming full race flathead and an idle that, if you knew what to listen for, was obviously this was a fast car.
To the non-hot rodder, the steps involved in souping up an engine sounded like a secret recipe in a lost language.
Those were the days of the 283, the flathead.
If you had a flathead, you wanted to put an Ardent conversion on it in 3.2s.
Add the nitrous to it on the side, put dual quads on.
Get into the engine and bore 30 over.
Change the carburation, change the injection.
It was like a male competition type thing. You know, who had the best car, who could put the most stuff on it.
They were rebels without applause, unsung geniuses, whose influence would reach all the way to Detroit. While most hot rodders built for go, there were some who built for show. They were known as customizers, and their cars were all about image. Custom cars were chopped to lower the roof and channeled to bring the body closer to the ground. The idea was to upstage the assembly line cars that Mom and Dad drove, with cars that were one of a kind.
Rock and roll was just emerging in a very big way, and you know, Elvis came along and everything else, so it was absolutely rebellious. But it was a refined rebellion in a sense. We always felt we were making things better.
California customizers added metal flecks to their paints to create colors like tangerine flake and candy apple red. And they decked out their interiors in elaborate tuck and roll upholstery, which could be done for as little as $100 across the Mexican border in Tijuana.
You know, the guys who had the custom cars, they were using those as love chariots.
That was usually the one who was going to be most popular and get the most girls, right? The guy Jimmy I was telling you about that had the Mercury, you know, it'd be 5 or 6 women in the car, and he'd be just driving us around because the car was jazzy, you know. And we wanted to be seen in it.
If you wanted to talk the talk, walk the walk, you turned to a quirky new publication from California called Hot Rod Magazine. Here were stories on the latest developments in cams, carbs, and free-flow exhausts. How-to articles on turning a Model A into a Highboy Roadster, or doing engine transplants that turned Fords into Fordilacs. The magazine became a publishing sensation, and hot rodder Gray Baskerville eventually became its senior editor.
I think the initial print run was 5,000. Hell, within a couple of years, it was over 100,000. And by the middle of the 50s, Hot Rod Magazine was worldwide.
You got any of your old Hot Rod magazine?
Oh, I've got some.
The Blackhawk Rod and Custom Club in Oregon, Illinois, is holding its first meeting in 37 years.
I mowed a lot of yards to buy these magazines.
Not there at all anyway.
The only thing I remember is Roger Kelly and I almost drove through that brick wall into the industrial arts room there with a 35 Ford and mechanical brakes that wouldn't work.
I had gotten into the hot rod thing. You know, I had a very nice Model A Ford. From reading hot rod magazines and things like that, you knew what had to be done to it. So the first thing you did was take the fenders off, and you started to make changes, and you kept going at it until you'd taken the whole car apart and end up with a whole different concept.
You remember your jackets? Hey, those are good old days.
Yes, it was. When you were wearing that, they knew who you were anyway.
Yeah. And Jerry, you was probably you had one.
Oh yeah, all the mothers in town would point you out and say, "Stay away from him."
Yeah. You're gonna grow up to be like that.
Anybody with that jacket.
Yeah, stay away from that guy.
I remember street racing when you were going 100 miles an hour down a street. Yeah, that was a rush. Tremendous rush, especially if you were ahead.
You pull up somebody at the light and they got a hot car, you got a hot car, next thing you know you're racing. It's simple as that. I mean, there was nothing pre-planned or anything, you know, you're just driving down the street looking for races back then.
One time we had somebody come to Byron Drive around and look for me. You know, we're looking for that girl that drives that big car that thinks she's so fast. And I'm like, oh, well, here I am, you know. Well, we got started, and this guy was going to play games like he was going to ram his car into my car. No dents in my car. So we pushed the gas down, we were gone. I don't think they ever came back to town again. It was one of those things, well, don't think we'll have any more kids back for a while. You know, they'll go home and say, boy, that girl's really fast.
Gear here, and I'm going in the second here, right behind him, and he's just in the third here, and he's still pulling me, and I thought, this guy's gonna whip me, and finally I stabbed him in the third. I'm going, and I'm doing 110 in third gear, and we ran into a fog bank.
He's trying to prove something, but what I don't know.
Hot rodders were starting to get a reputation. Bad boys with ducktail haircuts, blue dot taillights, and bad attitudes.
I think he's kidding. I can pass that pile of junk in low gear.
Kids in fast cars were being portrayed as a major threat to 1950s law and order.
Crash, 45th and High. 2 hot rodders. Street racing.
Real hopped-up death trap. Plain luck, no innocent people were killed.
How many times have I told you to stay out of those hot rods?
80 miles an hour on a city street is very serious, Mr. Simpson. You'll have to appear with him.
The media tended to exaggerate the danger, and Hollywood stunt drivers made a day's pay recreating it. But racing on public streets was beginning to claim lives. something had to be done.
This is drag racing, the country's fastest growing organized sport.
Hundreds of abandoned military airstrips were converted into drag strips. Making it happen was the National Hot Rod Association, formed in 1951 specifically to end teenage street racing.
It got them off the street and onto the strip, which was one of their slogans. And another one was dedicated to safety. All these things that were pioneered for the express purposes of legitimizing hot rodding so it would not be banned.
In the beginning, most hot rodders were happy to run the strip at 100 miles an hour, all for a trophy and a kiss from the local beauty queen. Some rodders mixed ordinary pump gas with nitro and methane into a high-speed witch's brew. In the years to come, when rods cost $100,000 and speeds hit 300 miles per hour, the real problem became how to slow down. The art of hot rodding had become a science. Big time, big bucks. But it had all begun with the high school bad boys, with a set of socket wrenches and a pocket full of change.
I won't say we were nerds, but we were just kind of, we like things that went fast. We all have our different ways of self-expression. Well, this was ours. It's the guy who has the fastest chariot.